Somewhere in the archive storage of the Smithsonian Institution, locked behind catalogued indifference and institutional silence, there are records that researchers have spent decades trying to access. Letters, field reports, bone measurements, and excavation logs from the late 1800s that describe discoveries so extraordinary, so fundamentally threatening to what we think we know about human history, that the people who filed them were quietly reassigned, their findings buried in footnotes, their careers redirected towards safer questions. At least, that is the story. And the reason that story will not die, the reason it keeps climbing back into the light no matter how many times it gets dismissed, is the same reason most persistent mysteries refuse to stay buried. Because somewhere underneath the exaggeration, underneath the folklore and the wishful thinking and the tabloid noise, there is a stubborn residue of something that does not quite fit. The claim, stripped to its core, is this: there was once a race of giants, not metaphorical giants, not men of impressive stature or legendary reputation, physical giants, humans of extraordinary size, some accounts placing them at 7, 8, even 10 feet tall, who built settlements across North America, who raised earthworks of staggering complexity, who were known to the indigenous peoples of the continent long before European contact, and who were then systematically erased from the academic record in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as newly formed scientific institutions worked to construct a clean, manageable narrative of human prehistory. The Smithsonian, according to those who press this claim hardest, was not just a passive beneficiary of that erasure, it was the engine driving it. Now, before you decide how seriously to take that, consider where the evidence comes from. Not fringe pamphlets, not anonymous internet posts. The primary sources for the giant skeleton claims are American newspapers from the 1800s, dozens of them, published in towns across Ohio, Illinois, West Virginia, and Kentucky. The Gastonia Gazette, the New York Times, Scientific American in its early years. These papers ran accounts of excavations that had turned up skeletal remains of unusual size, often discovered inside burial mounds attributed to the ancient Adena and Hopewell cultures. One 1883 report from the Smithsonian's own Bureau of Ethnology described the opening of a mound in Ohio that contained bones belonging to individuals of, and this is the institutional language, remarkable stature. The bones were catalogued. Then, by most accounts, they were never seen again. There are oversized artifacts too, stone axes and hammers discovered in mound excavations that seem disproportionate to the hands of an average-sized person, ceremonial objects of unusual weight, armor fragments and tools recovered from burial sites across the Midwest that some researchers claim could not have been comfortably used by anyone under 6.5 feet tall. None of this is conclusive. Any honest analysis has to acknowledge that newspaper editors in 1880 were not above embellishment, that measurements taken in muddy field conditions by untrained workers are unreliable, and that oversized tools may simply reflect craft, ceremony, or cultural symbolism rather than the dimensions of their makers. But the volume of these accounts, their geographic spread, their appearance in sources that were not otherwise sensationalist, creates a pattern that is at least worth sitting with. What makes the giant civilization theory genuinely compelling rather than simply entertaining is the company it keeps with things we already know to be true. The mounds exist. Nobody disputes that. Tens of thousands of earthworks constructed by pre-Columbian cultures stretch across the eastern half of North America, in formations of staggering precision and scale. Serpent Mound in Ohio, the Newark earthworks, Cahokia. These are real, they're ancient, and mainstream archaeology still carries significant gaps in explaining the full organizational capacity of the societies that built them. The ancient ruins are real, the incomplete records are real, and the distrust of official narratives is, given the actual documented history of how indigenous archaeology was handled in the 19th century, the looting, the misclassification, the deliberate subordination of the non-European history to European frameworks, entirely earned. Then there are the legends. And this is where the mystery deepens in a way that cuts across cultures with uncomfortable consistency. The Bible describes the Nephilim, beings of great size who walked the earth before the flood. The Book of Numbers calls the inhabitants of Canaan giants, before whom the Israelites felt like grasshoppers. Greek mythology is populated by titans and cyclopes and races of enormous men who preceded the gods themselves. Norse tradition has the Jotnar, the frost giants, who predate the creation of the human world. indigenous oral traditions across North America, Cherokee, Paiute, Choctaw, Algonquin, describe encounters with a red-haired race of giant people who occupied the land before their own ancestors arrived and who were eventually driven out or destroyed in wars that took generations to finish. The Paiute accounts in particular, centered around the Nevada and Utah region, describe these beings with a specificity and a cultural weight that is difficult to dismiss as simple allegory. These are not bedtime stories, they are memory traditions. So the question that sits at the center of all of this is not a simple one, and it does not resolve cleanly in either direction. Are these accounts pointing towards something real? A forgotten people? A chapter of human history that got deliberately closed before anyone could read it properly? Or are they the natural product of how humans mythologize the past? How we inflate our ancestors and our enemies? How we fill the silence left by missing records with stories large enough to explain the ruins we cannot otherwise account for? Because here is the thing about a civilization quietly removed from history. If the removal was thorough enough, the absence of evidence becomes its own kind of evidence. And that is exactly the kind of reasoning that keeps a mystery alive forever. When archaeologists actually sit down with the bones, something interesting happens. The mystery does not vanish, but it changes shape, and the shape it changes into tells you something important about how we construct the past, and why we are so willing to let certain stories override what the record actually contains. Start with the skeletal evidence itself. Human anatomy imposes hard limits. The tallest verified human being in recorded medical history was Robert Wadlow, who reached 8 feet 11 inches and whose body was destroying itself under the strain of a pituitary disorder that could not sustain him past the age of 22. The structural physics of bone, the demands of circulation, the mechanical load on joints, these are not cultural variables. A functionally healthy population of humans routinely reaching 10 or 12 feet in height is not something biology permits. When forensic anthropologists examine remains described in those 19th century newspaper accounts, the ones that can actually be traced and physically located, what they consistently find are bones belonging to people in the range of 6 feet to perhaps 6.5 feet. Tall by any era's standards, not giants, and in a period when average male height across many populations hovered closer to 5.5 feet, a 6'4" skeleton pulled from a mound by a farmer with no measuring training could very easily become, by the time it reached the county newspaper, a 7-foot colossus. This is not speculation, it is a documented pattern. Sensational journalism in the 1800s operated on a simple economy. Extraordinary headlines sold papers, editors knew it, reporters knew it. The infrastructure for fact-checking field discoveries simply did not exist in the way we assume it did when we read those old accounts with the reverence of archival sources. And then there are the photographs, the ones that circulate endlessly online, images of enormous skeletons laid out beside astonished excavators that turn out on examination to be entries from a worth 1,000 photo manipulation contest held in 2002. Real images, deliberately fabricated, now stripped of their origin, and passed around as documentation of suppressed truth. The hoaxes are not incidental to this story, they are load-bearing. The Cardiff giant, unearthed in New York in 1869 to enormous public fascination, turned out to be a carved gypsum figure buried by a man named George Hull, specifically to embarrass a preacher who had argued that biblical giants were literal. P.T. Barnum made a copy of it when he could not buy the original. 2 fake giants competing for the same audience at the same county fair. The public loved both of them. That appetite has never gone away, and the modern information environment feeds it with an efficiency that George Hull could not have dreamed of. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, and where the real injustice lives. The mound builders were real. Their civilization was extraordinary, and for a long stretch of American intellectual history, scholars and politicians and popular writers refused to believe that the ancestors of living indigenous people could have built them. Not because the evidence was unclear, because accepting it required acknowledging a level of pre-Columbian cultural sophistication that conflicted with narratives already being used to justify land dispossession. So they invented a vanished race, a separate people, more advanced, who had been wiped out before the quote-unquote primitive tribes that Europeans encountered arrived on the scene. Some versions of this theory made the vanished builders white, Some made them a lost Israelite tribe, some made them giants. The specifics were less important than the function, which was to sever the connection between living indigenous people and the monumental past visible in the landscape around them. This is the suppressed history that is actually documentable, not giants, the deliberate misrepresentation of indigenous cultures by American institutions in the service of a convenient mythology. The Smithsonian was involved in that project in ways that are real and recoverable and worth being angry about. But the solution to that genuine institutional failure is not to replace one false narrative with another. Mound builder cultures were not a race to hide giants. They were misrepresented to justify a political agenda. Those are different claims with different evidence, and they should not be allowed to collapse into each other just because both involve institutional deception. The reason the giant myth persists is not because the evidence keeps accumulating. It persists because it offers something the official record often does not, which is a sense of scale, of lost grandeur, of a past so large and strange that our present feels like a diminishment by comparison. Conspiracy spaces understand this hunger and feed it efficiently, recycling the same photographs, the same newspaper excerpts, the same Smithsonian accusations in formats designed for sharing rather than scrutiny. The fringe history ecosystem runs on the emotional logic of the cover-up, where the absence of proof becomes proof of removal, and skepticism becomes complicity. But here is what the evidence actually teaches, if you follow it honestly all the way to the end. The ancient past is genuinely mysterious. Human prehistory contains chapters we have barely opened. The mounds are real, and their builders were sophisticated beyond what comfortable narratives have usually acknowledged. Institutional science has suppressed things, gotten things wrong, served political agendas at the expense of truth. All of that is documentable, and none of it requires giants to be extraordinary. The real lesson buried in all of this is not that giants existed and were hidden from you. It is that the truth about the past is almost always stranger, and more unjust and more complicated than either the official version or the alternative one admits. Question the sanitized story, question the spectacular one, and learn to sit with a mystery without needing to fill it with something larger than the evidence can actually hold.